This presentation is titled Evolution of Dairy Production Systems in Australia and Can the Country Stop the Rot? It was delivered to the Australian Dairy Farmers Farming Systems and Herd Improvement Policy Advisory Group in April 2020. In addition to the committee members being in attendance, there were also quite a number of other ADF and Dairy Australia staff. The presentation covers the following. Firstly, confirming the basis for the countries being reviewed and compared. Then what are the trends in production and profitability? What is driving the Australian trends? What is the impact of farmers' choice of production system? And finally, what might need to change the future for Australia? This table categorises the countries in the Australian states in regard to milk market focus, climate, and the level of government support or intervention. This table is included in the published version of my paper. New Zealand, Uruguay, and Tasmania are the three regions with a dominant export focus, with South Africa, New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia having a dominant domestic focus, while the other regions have a mixed focus. New Zealand and Tasmania have a cooler temperate climate, with Queensland being the only subtropical climate, while all the balance have a hot temperate climate, notwithstanding the use has a full range of climates. 4 of the countries have little to no government support in their dairy industry, while Argentina and the United States have some government intervention in their market. South Africa is an interesting mix of pasture-based and feedlot farms, and a great case study for the Australian industry in that they recognised in the 1990s that they had drifted too far towards US-type cows and production systems, and reversed this trend, emerging as a powerhouse of profitability and growth. If you're wondering why Ireland is not included in the study, then it's simply due to me not presently having access to their data. This graph, covering 40 years of milk production for Australia and New Zealand, is such a simple representation of the 20+ year problem besetting the Australian dairy industry. The principle this immediately helps to highlight is that the problems in the Australian industry are unlikely to be one-off milk price or weather events. Given the biological nature of dairy farming, it would be reasonable to expect the reasons for the lack of milk supply growth that emerged in 2000 would have been evident from around 1995 or earlier. This graph helps to highlight that the same trends are evident across all states with the exception of Tasmania, which has had consistent growth. Also, Western Australia has at least been holding steady with its milk supply. This graph emphasises the trend in milk supply growth from the perspective of the 6 countries being compared, where 2002-03 milk supply for all is set at 1. All countries have been growing milk supply except Australia in gold or yellow. Even countries like South Africa in green and Argentina in light blue, with all their inherent internal problems, have been growing strongly. All of these countries are suffering the same general environmental, societal, processing, marketing, and consumer challenges as Australia. So why the absence of growth in milk supply in Australia? Firstly, it's essential to have profitable dairy businesses to provide the foundation or opportunity for growth. Similarly, some level of profitability is required to attract investment into dairying, either from within the industry or from new investors. And growth in milk supply is required for milk processors to thrive, or they must survive by cannibalising each other's milk supply. So what has been happening to farm profitability across these 6 countries? And what is driving any changes in profitability? This graph has return on capital on the vertical axis, which is the truest definition of profit, and the years on the horizontal axis. South Africa in green is the most profitable of the countries by quite a large margin. South Africa beats New Zealand in black, as land prices in particular, as well as cow prices, are much lower in South Africa, with this being primarily a result of the high personal and political risk in that country. New Zealanders, on the other hand, are known for paying very high prices for land, which does result in their lower return on capital, or return on the total money invested. Noticeably, Australia in yellow moves from a more competitive position in the early period, often with a higher level of profitability than New Zealand, to being on average the worst performer in the latter part of the period. This graph has operating profit margin on the vertical axis, which is the percentage of each dollar earned that is retained after all operating expenses are paid. This ratio is similar to the one that Dairy Australia has selected for monitoring profitability going forward. Although there was a lot of volatility in this ratio, New Zealand in black is clearly in the strongest position, with South Africa in green in the next strongest position. All four of the other countries, including the US in red, have lower operating profit margins, with Australia again dropping to the bottom of the pack as time progresses. This graph has profit per hectare on the vertical axis. Again, there was a lot of volatility for all countries, though New Zealand and South Africa have emerged over time as equally profitable on this measure and in the strongest position by a wide margin. Australia, represented by Victoria, has again moved from a competitive position in the early period to the weakest position in the later period. Victoria should comfortably beat Argentina and Uruguay on this measure, given pasture harvest is around 50% higher in Victoria. So this really does highlight the terrible position Australia dairying is now in. This graph has profit per cow on the vertical axis. Although again there is lots of volatility for all countries, New Zealand in black is definitely in the strongest position, with South Africa in the next strongest position. Australia emerges as the weakest of the countries, and given Australian farmers are the most indebted outside New Zealand, this further weakens their position and has resulted in many recent years where farmers have on average been in a loss-making position. This graph again has profit per cow on the vertical axis, though this includes all the states of Australia as well as the three regions of Victoria separately. This confirms that the rest of Australia is generally in a similar position to Victoria in regards to profitability per cow. Tasmania in dark green has delivered higher profitability in recent years than the other states, as has Western Australia in yellow. South Australia in light bright red is the state with the poorest performance over the last 17 years. So what are the factors causing this loss of profitability? Firstly, let's look at milk price, with supermarkets, milk processors and MG's implosion all often mentioned as major contributors to the industry's problems. This graph has milk price in US cents per litre of energy-corrected milk. There are a number of interesting factors to highlight here. New Zealand milk price in black is the most volatile, given that country's almost total reliance on the export market. South Africa in green does have an advantage over all countries except the US through to 2011, which is what would have historically been expected given their domestic focus, their domestic production focus, though this advantage has disappeared in recent years. The US milk price in red is almost always significantly higher than for all these other countries, which may be an initial warning for those advocating pasture-based Southern Hemisphere countries learn from or imitate the US-type production system. Australian or Victorian milk price in yellow compares favourably with New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay and South Africa throughout the period. And all of these other countries have increased their milk supply over this period, whereas Australia, with the exception of Tasmania, has declined. This graph outlines the milk price in all the Australian states and compares these with the dotted lines of New Zealand in black and the US in purple. Interestingly, from 2008, New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australian farmers received milk prices similar to or above the prices paid in the US, and yet milk production continued to decline in New South Wales and Queensland in particular. So milk price is not a relevant contributing factor to the decline in milk production in Australia. What about weather or drought? Could there be 20 years of worse weather than all the other countries, with all bar New Zealand having dry continental climates as well? There is no evidence to support this. How about the impact of deregulation? Well, Victoria has had milk production declining even though it was advantaged by deregulation, gaining access to new markets like New South Wales. Also, milk prices in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia are comparatively much higher now than before deregulation, including now being similar to or higher than in the US. How about size of farm? Again, could this really be a 20-year problem compared to other countries? In reality, size of farm is not generally an issue in pasture-based dairy farming, as there are so few economies of scale. This can be seen in these two graphs that outline the impact on profitability of farm size in land area on the left and numbers of cows and herd on the right. In addition, Australian farmers are on average larger than in the United States, Argentina, and Uruguay, and are more than competitively sized from an international perspective. So now let's look at the trends for cost of production, arguably the most important single measure outside return on capital for dairy businesses to monitor. Why? Because maintaining a low cost of production that is competitive with other export-focused countries is essential, especially as the world has become more interconnected. Even most domestic-focused dairy industries are now exposed to imported dairy products, so they need to be able to compete with these products on price. You can see in this graph that since 2007, Australian cost of production has increased at a much higher rate than in New Zealand or the United States or South Africa. However, the United States in purple does have a substantially higher cost of production throughout the entire period, which might make some of you wonder why so many farmers in Australia have been adopting US-type production systems. To further highlight the international comparisons, I've added the table with compound annual growth rate, or year-on-year increases in cost of production for the 6 countries. 3 countries have higher increases, including Australia, and 3 have lower increases. Remember, it is the 3 with lower increases in cost of production that have been consistently increasing milk supply and growing the dairy industry over the last 20 years. Whereas the other 3 countries have all at some point stopped growing, with Argentina lately exhibiting some of the same problems as we're seeing in Australia. This graph outlines the cost of production in all the Australian states, plus the 3 regions of Victoria, and compares these with the dotted lines of New Zealand in black and the US in purple. The rest of Australia is similar to Victoria in regards to changes to cost of production. All regions have lost ground compared to New Zealand and lost a lot of the advantage compared to the United States. It is interesting to note that even Tasmania has lost international competitiveness, though it is the state that is in the best position in Australia. You can also see how New South Wales and Queensland have had the poorest outcome, now having a much higher cost of production than the US. South Australia also looks very poor throughout, especially given it is a southern state, so has natural advantages in producing milk at a lower cost compared to New South Wales and Queensland. Western Australia has lost its competitiveness compared to Victoria from earlier years, and Northern Victoria has lost its competitiveness with Southern Victoria and Tasmania. These trends can be further highlighted when milk prices compared to cost of production. The solid lines in this graph are for the Victorian and Tasmanian milk price. And the dotted lines are cost of production for Victoria, Tasmania, the 3 regions of Victoria, plus New Zealand in black. Firstly, this graph highlights the loss of international competitiveness with New Zealand for all regions of Australia. And secondly, it highlights the loss of profitability, as the margin between milk price and cost of production has reduced to the extent that when some debt servicing is added, a majority of farmers are no longer profitable. This graph in Australian dollars outlines economic cost of production as opposed to the more commonly used accounting cost of production. Economic cost of production includes a cost of capital, with this based on average lease values for land and a premium on the risk-free cost of capital for livestock, vehicles, and machinery. If an industry could convince a government or milk processor to guarantee a milk price that allowed average farmers to be profitable, then this is the most logical basis on which a milk price could be set. Of course, this would abrogate the farmers from responsibility to improve productivity or to be internationally competitive, or even internally be competitive with other comparative land uses. So if a high and increasing cost of production is at the heart of the Australian dairy industry's problems, is this due to poor performance in the area of pasture harvest? In this graph of pasture harvest, Victoria in yellow averages around 8 tonne dry matter per hectare, although pasture harvest in Australia ranges enormously from over 10 tonne in Tasmania to between 5 and 10 tonne per hectare in other regions. New Zealand in black has the highest level of pasture harvest, and South Africa in green has done an impressive job of closing the gap with New Zealand. Both countries have a huge natural advantage in pasture production compared to the other countries. New Zealand largely without the need or cost of irrigation, and South Africa with the addition of irrigation. However, Argentina and Uruguay have a significant disadvantage compared to Australia and the other countries. When the table of year-on-year percentage increases is added, you can see that Victoria and Tasmania have done better at improving pasture harvest than the other countries, with the exception of South Africa. You will remember from the graph of cost of production that in the early years, highlighted in red in this graph, from 2003 to 2006, Australia, Uruguay, and Argentina were all competitive with New Zealand. Now, if you look at the black New Zealand pasture harvest line, you will see that it is flat. So New Zealand has made little, if any, progress in increasing pasture harvest per hectare over the last 17 years, and yet it has done very well as an industry at maintaining a low cost of production. So Southern Australia has made more progress in improving pasture harvest than New Zealand, and yet it has significantly increased its cost of production and lost its profitability. So pasture harvest does not explain any of the loss in profitability or loss in competitiveness compared to New Zealand or the other countries, with the exception of South Africa. This pasture harvest graph includes the 3 main dairy regions in Victoria plus Tasmania, plus 5-year periods for Western Australia and South Australia when comparative data was available. New Zealand in black and Argentina in light blue are also included as dotted lines. Pasture harvest per hectare does have a direct relationship to cost of pasture, and cost of pasture has a direct relationship to total cost of feed, which is the biggest component of farm costs. So the level of pasture harvest is a key determinant of profitability, but it is not the area that needs urgent attention to change the level of profitability in the Australian dairy industry. I would now like to review what the changes have been in production system. What has been happening to the farm production system over the last 17 years, and what are the impacts of changing production system? This graph plots changes in pasture as a percent of the total diet, with this ratio defining the production system. New Zealand stands out with its high percent of pasture in the diet. Tasmania in light green also stands out in this graph. Once the table of change over the 17-year period is added, it is evident that New Zealand has changed its production system little over the 17-year period, with pasture continuing to be over 75% of the diet. Like farmers in other countries, New Zealand farmers do increase the use of supplements and push up their cost of production when milk price is high, but they reverse most, if not all of this, when milk price turns down. Tasmania has had a significantly larger decrease than New Zealand in pasture percent of diet, but as the table of change highlights, it is Victoria and Argentina where the much larger decreases have occurred. And it is Victoria, along with the balance of mainland Australia, as well as Argentina, where the steepest increases in cost of production and loss of profitability have occurred. These changes have coincided with significant increases in the amount of concentrate fed per cow and the continuing breeding of larger US-type cows. This table might help with understanding the impact on cost of production as less pasture is fed per cow and more concentrate and other supplement is fed. The table includes the production and or purchase cost of pasture, concentrate, and forage, and then calculates the ratio of concentrate and forage cost to pasture cost. The ratio of concentrate cost and forage cost to pasture cost is the key here. Look at the scale of this for, say, concentrates in Victoria, where they're on average 240% more expensive than pasture, or in Tasmania, where they're 450% more expensive than pasture. Forage costs are also very significantly more expensive than pasture, although not to the same extent as concentrates. So as more and more low-cost pasture is replaced with hugely more expensive supplements in the cow's diet, the cost of production generally increases. When we do look at litres produced per cow, the United States in red looks very impressive, with production increasing year on year at a consistent and rapid rate. All the other countries are delivering regular increases in milk production per cow, though presumably it's the US performance that excites so many dairy farmers in other countries. However, it is important to remember that production per cow does not positively correlate with improvements to profit on pasture-based farms. And although the US farmers are efficient and highly productive, their cost of production is much too high to make them profitable at international milk prices. This graph plots the impact of milk production per cow on the horizontal axis on profit represented by return on capital on the vertical axis. This result is from an unbiased set of data of Southern Australia farms. In this case, there was no positive relationship between milk production per cow and profit, which is a consistent result from other studies of pasture-based dairy farming that show low to no relationship between increasing milk production per cow and increasing profit. What can be inferred is that very low or very high levels of milk production per cow are likely to reduce profit. This relationship is quite different to what is evident with feedlot or full TMR dairy businesses, where increasing milk production per cow does correlate with increases in profit. This highlights the important structural differences between feedlot farms and pasture-based farms. This graph outlines milk production per cow for all the states and includes dotted lines for Australia as a whole in black and for New Zealand in light green. New Zealand has one of the lowest levels of milk production per cow, but the highest level of profitability. South Australia has the highest level of milk production per cow and on average has the lowest level of profitability in the group. Queensland has comparatively high levels of concentrate fed per cow, though has the lowest level of milk production per cow in Australia, with this mostly related to the impact of subtropical weather on both cows and pasture. This graph outlines the cost of total feed per litre. The table outlines the costs that are included in this calculation. These costs include all concentrate, forage and pasture costs, as well as young stock rearing feed costs. So as pasture becomes a lower percentage of the diet, the average cost of feed increases per tonne. This increase in cost per tonne is of such a large quantum that it increases the cost of feed per litre. New Zealand has easily the lowest cost of feed per litre of the group. Australia, Argentina and Uruguay have all moved from having total feed costs similar to New Zealand at the start of the period to being much higher than New Zealand and closer to the US by the end. Although the US price of concentrates and forages per tonne are lower than almost all other countries in the world, the total cost of feed per litre in the US is much higher than for all other countries in the group. Once again, although this may be a sustainable position for the US given their higher milk price, there is certainly a big warning for farmers in all the other countries not to adopt the US type production system if you're exposed to internationally traded milk prices. This table breaks down expenses per litre down into total feed cost versus labour cost versus all other costs. It includes a calculation of the percentage of total expenses for each of these groupings. As the table confirms, the total cost of feed comprises around 40 to 60% of total costs for pasture-based farms and around 60 to 70% for feedlot farms. So total cost of feed is the dominant cost in any dairy business. And if a group of farmers or an industry wants to significantly change its cost of production, then this must be the area where the main changes are implemented. This table outlines the total operating expenses per litre. Since 2009, New Zealand has had the lowest operating expenses per litre, and the United States has had the highest expenses over the entire period. Argentina and Uruguay start the period with the lowest expenses per litre, but from 2012 have the next highest level of expenses after the US. Australia commences the period with similar operating expenses per litre to New Zealand and much lower expenses in South Africa, but has progressively increased expenses to a level that is significantly higher than both. One final graph of this type to further reinforce the dire present situation for the Australian industry. This graph includes the Victorian milk price as a yellow dotted line, which is effectively the same as for Tasmania and largely similar to New Zealand. The solid lines include cost of production for Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Again, this highlights the Australian dairy industry's loss in competitiveness with New Zealand and how there is no longer a sustainable margin between cost of production and milk price. This again begs the question, why is the Australian industry continuing to move progressively closer to the US type production system and further away from the New Zealand production system? I'd like to briefly describe some of the changes that happen as production systems change from an analysis of a large Australian data set. This graph shows the impact of pasture percent in the diet on profit. On the vertical axis is return on capital, and the horizontal axis is the percent of pasture in the cow's diet. The relationship is significant with a relatively low R-squared value of 0.08, although the trend is quite strong. I've now added another graph, which is the same graph from a South African data set. This relationship is also significant, with a higher R-squared value of 0.17 and an even stronger trend. Now I've added a second Australian graph, with this showing the impact of pasture percent in the diet on profit per cow. This is also a significant relationship with a strong trend and an R-squared value of 0.12. What these graphs highlight is that as the percent of pasture in the diet reduces, profitability reduces at an increasing rate. So what are some of the main areas of impact as pasture as a percent of the diet decreases? Firstly, cost of production increases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. Secondly, both supplement cost per litre and total feed cost per litre increase substantially as pasture percent of the diet decreases. And of particular importance, pasture harvest decreases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. There are in fact a range of other significant negative impacts on costs as pasture as a percent of the diet decreases, which are outlined in more detail in the second paper that I had published this year. So if we review this milk production graph again and project it forward another 5 years, with these projections based on reviewing historical performance and then only altering trends on the basis of known changes in these dairy industries, then the following milk supply growth could be forecast, which for Australia would be a continuation of negative growth of around negative 0.5% to negative 1% year on year. As we all get told in any self-help program or any business improvement program, if something is going wrong, then the first step is to identify the problem. And unfortunately, there is no sign the Australian industry is close to doing this. This graph is from an excellent paper by Professor Bill Malcolm and Alex Sinnott from the University of Melbourne, titled "Things the Most Successful Farmers and Their Advisors Get Right." It outlines the change process for a farmer and work effectiveness during the transition, which applies equally to an industry. You can see the 3 phases of transition, starting with getting used to the new circumstances or recognizing there was a problem to solve. This phase is characterized by immobilization and then denial. This precedes the second relearning phase, which is followed by the third becoming effective phase. The Australian dairy industry appears to have stalled in the first phase. At present, there is no identification of the actual problem, although there is a recognition of a crisis of sorts. It appears that it is everyone else's fault, and definitely not the fault or responsibility of the farmers or their industry organisations. It is the fault of the supermarkets, the milk processors, MG's implosion, the drought or other weather events, the government for deregulating the industry or for not re-regulating the industry, or for not protecting dairy farmers from competition deemed unfair, or some other rules. So here is the forecast of total milk production levels in billions of litres for all 6 countries over the next few years, although the US production is only for their exported volumes. Any thoughts that a lack of milk production growth in some countries like Australia will result in upward pressure on international milk prices to improve the situation need to be countered by the performance of the US industry, what I would describe as the elephant in the room, as this large, efficient, well-capitalized producer is likely to fill any milk shortfalls along with some of the other more efficient milk producers in Europe, New Zealand, and elsewhere. So in summary, the evolution in international farm production systems is causing major changes to the competitiveness of different countries. It will be farmer choices of production system within these individual countries that will determine the internal comparative advantage and growth rate of their dairy industry. Australian farmers have been adopting production systems that have reduced internal comparative advantage and reduced international competitiveness. To regain comparative advantage and international competitiveness, large numbers of farmers need to significantly increase the percentage of pasture in the cow's diet, potentially by something in the order of 10 to 15%, though this may require a change in cow type for many farmers. One positive aspect is that this would be a back to the future moment for the industry, as farmers would need to adopt production systems that were common 20 to 30 years ago. And as a result, many farmers would be utilizing existing skills rather than needing to learn new skills or adopt new technology. That's the end of my prepared slides. I'd highly recommend you all read the report titled Building a Resilient, Flourishing, Internationally Competitive Dairy Industry in Ireland, the cover of which is left on this final slide. The report was written in 2015 in preparation for the removal of subsidies in the EU. The two authors are both recognised as legends in the dairy industry there, and the report outlines how Ireland should promote and protect what they identified as a grass-rich production system, taking positives from the New Zealand industry, and being wary to learn the lessons of what they described as happening when it all goes wrong in countries like Northern Ireland and Australia, when a grass-poor production system is adopted. Thank you.